Vivian Ashcroft threw a champagne glass across the marble terrace, not because she was drunk, but because the mechanic hadn't flinched. Not even a little. Every executive at that party had laughed when she made the joke, "Fix my Porsche and I'll marry you." It was supposed to humiliate him, put him in his place, send him back to whatever forgotten town he'd crawled out of. But Denzel Washington just looked at her, calm, steady, like a man who had already survived the worst thing life could throw at him, and turned back to the engine. That silence cost Vivian something she wouldn't understand until much later, and what he found buried inside that car was about to end an empire. If this is the kind of story you come here for, stay until the end, because what happens to the man who built that empire is not going to feel like justice. It's going to feel like something heavier than that. To understand how we got here, we have to go back 5 weeks. Back to a two-bay garage on the wrong side of Bellhaven, Rhode Island, where a man with $14 in his checking account was lying flat a creeper underneath a rusted F-150, torquing a bolt that had been fighting him for 20 minutes. His name was Denzel Washington. He was 37 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Josie who needed new winter boots before the first frost, a coffee maker held together with electrical tape, and a silence in his chest that had lived there for 3 years, ever since his wife Naomi died in a hospital hallway while he was still parking the car. He didn't talk about that. He didn't talk about most things. He fixed engines, picked his daughter up from school, made her dinner at the same scarred kitchen table that had belonged to Naomi's grandmother, and went to sleep early enough to be up before the sun. That was the whole architecture of his life. Small, quiet, held together by routine and a kind of discipline that comes from having no other option but to keep going. His phone buzzed against the concrete floor of the garage. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He ignored it a second time. On the third ring, he slid out from under the truck, wiped his hands on a rag that had stopped being useful weeks ago, and looked at the screen. Unknown number. A Rhode Island exchange that belonged to zip codes where people didn't check their bank balance before ordering lunch. The woman on the line didn't bother with pleasantries. "Is this Denzel Washington, the mechanic?" "That's what it says on the sign," he said. A pause, like she wasn't used to being answered without deference. "I was given your name by a man named Otto Kessler, over at Kessler Restorations. He said you specialize in vintage European work." Denzel felt something shift behind his ribs, the way it did whenever that name surfaced. Otto Kessler had been more than a name to him once. He'd been the only teacher Denzel ever had who mattered, a German-born engineer who spoke to machines the way other men spoke to old friends, patient, exact, without ego. Denzel had trained under him for 3 years in a converted barn outside of Millbrook Falls, Ohio, back before everything in his life had rearranged itself around loss. Otto Kessler had been dead for 4 years, a workshop fire outside Akron. Denzel had gone to a memorial with no body in the casket and had never fully believed the fire report, though he had never said that out loud to anyone. "What's the car?" he asked. 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS, the woman said, original engine, or what's left of it. He leaned against the truck bed. "What's wrong with it?" "That's the problem," she said. "Nobody can tell me. I've had 3 shops look at it. One told me to gut it and rebuild from nothing. Another told me it was beyond saving and tried to buy it off me on the spot for a fraction of what it's worth." Her voice cooled by several degrees. "I don't like it when people think I won't notice." "I imagine not," Denzel said carefully. "Are you available this week?" she asked. He thought about the $14. He thought about Josie's boots. "I can be there Thursday morning," he said. "I'll expect you at 8, she said, and gave him an address on the Bellhaven shoreline in the kind of neighborhood Denzel had driven past exactly once 3 summers ago on a trip with Naomi before the diagnosis, before any of it. He remembered thinking the houses out there looked like they belonged to a different country. He told Josie about the job that night while she did her homework at the kitchen table, the one with the burn mark on the corner that she liked to trace with her finger when she was thinking hard about something. "Got a job Thursday," he said, setting down a bowl of pasta. "Might keep me busy a while." She looked up. She had her mother's eyes, the thing Denzel still hadn't gotten used to, even 2 years in. "What kind of car?" she asked. "Old Porsche," he said, "really old. The kind they don't make anymore." "Is it pretty?" she asked. One of the most beautiful cars ever built, he said, if nobody's wrecked it past saving. Can you fix it? She asked. Don't know yet, he said, and picked up his fork, and the apartment went quiet except for the radiator knocking 2 floors below traffic. That was their life. Small and quiet and enough. He found the address Thursday morning with 15 minutes to spare, which told him immediately he'd underestimated the size of the property, because he needed every one of those minutes just to get from the gate to the house. He parked his truck at the edge of the motor court, away from a cluster of vehicles that cost more than he'd earned in the last 3 years combined, and he could hear laughter before he even opened the door. The particular kind of laughter that comes with champagne before noon and the certainty that the day belongs to you. There was a pool. Of course there was a pool. Even with the October air going sharp off the water, a dozen people stood around it in expensive coats, holding glasses, talking with the loose confidence of people who had never once had to choose between a car payment and a water heater. A woman broke away from group and walked toward him. Denzel had looked her up the night before. Vivian Ashcroft, 41, chief executive of Ashcroft Capital Group, a name that showed up in business magazines beside words like visionary and ruthless, depending on who was writing the piece. She'd built the firm from a small private equity shop into something that moved billions across 3 continents. The photographs hadn't prepared him for the real thing. She stopped 4 feet away and looked him over the way you'd look at a car yourself. Quick, efficient, cataloging. Washington, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not amusement exactly, more like a test she was already running. Otto didn't mention you were young. I'm 37, Denzel said. Is the car in the garage? She turned without answering and walked towards the 6-bay structure set off from the main house. He followed. He could feel the party watching, the specific kind of attention people give something they expect to be entertaining. The garage was climate-controlled, spotless, 5 bays holding cars Denzel recognized and respected from a professional distance, a newer 911, a Mercedes SL, something Italian he couldn't immediately place. But the 6th bay, nearest the back wall, stopped him cold. She was under a fitted cover, but even the shape of her told him everything. He set down his bag and folded the cover back with both hands. The 1973 911 RS had been silver once. Now she looked tired the way only a machine can look tired, worn down not by use but by the absence of it, by sitting still when she'd been built to move. The bodywork was intact. The interior was original. He opened the hood and felt the hair on his arms rise before his mind caught up to why. Someone had been inside this engine, not the shops Vivian had already burned through. Someone with a completely different vocabulary for what an engine was and what it needed. He leaned in close, and there, stamped into the block in a location no factory ever used, in a spot only a very specific kind of person would think to check, was a mark. Not a serial number, not a manufacturer's stamp, a signature, a small engraved gear with a single hash line through one tooth. Denzel's throat closed. He straightened up slowly and turned around. Vivian was standing in the doorway watching him. 2 of her guests had drifted over behind her, men in weekend blazers holding coffee cups with the expression of people expecting to be mildly amused by the help. Well, Vivian said, can you fix it? One of the men laughed before Denzel could answer. Vivian, darling, the thing's been sitting 6 years. Maybe it's time to call it a display piece. The other pointed his cup at Denzel. What do you think, Chief? Worth saving. Denzel ignored them both. He was still working through what he'd just seen. Where did you get this car? He asked. Vivian's easy expression shifted just slightly. It was gifted to me 7 years ago. By who? He asked, a hesitation, small but real. A business associate. Do you know its history before that? Who owned it? Who serviced it? I never asked, she said, her chin lifting a fraction. Is that relevant to fixing it? It might be relevant to everything, Denzel said quietly. The coffee cup man laughed again, said something under his breath to his friend. Evelyn's eyes stayed on Denzel, something in the exchange landing even though she couldn't yet place where. Can you fix it or not? She asked. Denzel looked back at the engine, at the signature, at a car that had no business existing the way it existed. I can fix it, he said, but I'm going to need time, and I'm going to need you to answer some questions when I ask them. The coffee cup man smirked at his friend again. And that was the moment Vivian did it. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the audience. Maybe it was just the reflex of a woman who had spent 20 years maintaining a certain persona in front of certain people. Untouchable, sharp, always the one delivering the line instead of receiving it. She smiled at her guests, gestured at Denzel with an easy, dismissive wave. "You know what?" she said, loud enough to carry across the whole terrace. "If you can actually fix that thing, maybe I'll marry you." The laughter that followed was immediate and generous, the kind that rewards someone for a good line. Denzel didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't look embarrassed or angry or amused. He looked at Vivian Ashcroft for a long moment, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether it actually matters. Then he turned back to the engine. "I'll start Monday," he said. "I'll need full access to the garage and any paperwork that came with the car." He folded the cover back over, picked up his bag, and walked to his truck. Behind him, the laughter was already fading into the next conversation, the way cruelty this casual always does, forgotten by the people who dealt it before it even lands. He sat in the truck for a full minute before starting the engine, both hands on the wheel, his mind somewhere else entirely. A gear, a single hash mark through one tooth. He had seen that exact symbol exactly once before in his life, 15 years ago, in a converted barn in Ohio, watching Otto Kessler stamp his signature into an engine he'd rebuilt from nothing. Otto Kessler, who had died in a fire 4 years ago, except the car in that garage had been gifted to Vivian Ashcroft 7 years ago. 3 years before Otto was supposed to have died, he thought about a forged-looking bracket he'd noticed on the firewall. A wiring harness routed in a way that served no mechanical purpose at all. The way the interior panel on the driver's side sat a few milliliters proud of where it should have been, like something had been placed behind it. He started the truck. He had a daughter to pick up, a garage to open in the morning, and $14 that had become in the last 24 hours something slightly closer to enough. But underneath the exhaustion, underneath the routine, underneath a grief that lived quietly in the background of every single day, something else was stirring, something that felt for the first time in 2 years dangerously like purpose. He would be back in that garage Monday morning. And by Wednesday he would understand that the joke Vivian Ashcroft had made in front of her friends was the least dangerous thing happening on that property. The most dangerous thing was already sitting inside that engine, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Monday came without ceremony, the way Mondays do. Denzel was up before 5, made coffee in the second-hand machine from the church rummage sale, and drove out to the estate while Bellhaven was still gray and half asleep. Vivian met him at the garage door in jeans and a plain sweater, no audience this time, no champagne. Just her, arms crossed, watching him act his tools with the same clinical attention she'd give a quarterly report. He worked through the week in near silence, methodical, unhurried, the way he approached everything. He documented the forged bracket. He traced the wiring harness to a junction box tucked behind the driver's side panel, a box that had no business being in a 1973 Porsche because the technology inside it hadn't existed yet in 1973. He didn't open it, not yet. He photographed everything the way Otto had taught him, frame by frame, angle by angle, evidence before instinct. By Wednesday afternoon, Vivian was in the garage more than she was anywhere else on the property, perched on a stool in the corner with her laptop open and mostly ignored, watching does Denzel work the way a person watches something they don't understand but can't look away from. "What are you not telling me?" she asked, on the third day, without looking up from her screen. He kept his eyes on the block. "Not yet," he said. "When?" she asked. "When I'm sure," he said, and something about the flatness of it, the total absence of performance, made her close the laptop and just watch him instead. On Thursday morning, everything changed. A man walked into the garage without knocking, tall, silver-templed, wearing the kind of tailored coat that cost more than Denzel's truck. Julian Voss, Vivian's business partner of 11 years, co-founder of Ashcroft Capital's overseas fund, the man whose name appeared beside hers on every masthead, every press release, every deal memo the firm had signed in a decade. "Vivian, darling," he said, his eyes moving from her to Denzel and back, "I didn't realize you'd hired a project manager for the antique." "He's the mechanic," Vivian said. Voss's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, a small recalibration, quick and cold. He walked closer to the car, closer than any of the pool party guests had come. "How's the old girl coming along?" he asked, running 2 fingers along the fender in a way that was too familiar for a man who claimed no history with the car. Denzel watched his hand. Slowly, he said, "Some things take time to do right." Voss's eyes flicked to the open hood, to the engine bay, and for exactly 1 second, Denzel watched something pass across his face that had nothing to do with casual interest. It was the look of a man checking whether a door he'd locked was still locked. Voss recovered instantly, smiled at Vivian, said something about a call he had to take, and left. Denzel didn't say anything until the door shut behind him. Then he looked at Vivian. "Who is that to you?" he asked. "Business partner," she said. "Founded the firm with me." "Why?" "Because he looked at this car like he already knew what was inside it," Denzel said. That night, Denzel didn't go home right away. He sat in his truck outside the gate with his laptop, the free Wi-Fi from a coffee shop down the road, bleeding faintly into the parking lot, and he searched everything he could find on Julian Voss. Fund performance reports, SEC filings, a decade of press coverage that painted him as the disciplined half of Ashcroft Capital, the man who kept Vivian's ambition tethered to reality. But buried 3 pages into a search result in an old regional business journal from Ohio was a name that stopped Denzel's hand on the trackpad. A small item about a workshop fire outside Akron 4 years earlier, and a single line noting that the property had, until 18 months before the fire, been under a lease held by a shell entity connected to an early-stage fund managed by a firm called Voss Capital Partners, the predecessor to Ashcroft's overseas fund. Denzel sat very still in the dark cab of his truck for a long time. The next morning, he called a number he hadn't dialed in 4 years, one that still lived in his phone under a name he'd never deleted. It rang 11 times before a woman answered, brisk official. "Patricia Vance," she said. Denzel explained who he was, what he'd found, the mark on the engine block, the fire, the shell company. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that meant someone was writing very fast. "Don't touch anything else in that car," Vance said finally, "and don't tell anyone what you just told me, not the client." "Not anyone. I need 48 hours. He kept working through Friday, kept his questions to himself, kept his face as unreadable as Vivian's had once been to her guests. But on Saturday, everything accelerated at once. He was alone in the garage in the early afternoon when he finally opened the junction box behind the driver's side panel, not because Vance had told him to, but because the car itself had been asking him to for a week, and Denzel had never been able to leave a machine's question unanswered. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with the kind of care that only a man terrified of being found would use, was a flash drive, a folded letter, and a photograph of Otto Kessler standing next to a much younger Julian Voss in front of the exact car Denzel was kneeling beside. He unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakable, Otto's careful engineer's print. Denzel read it twice standing in the cold garage with his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the day Naomi died. The letter named 11 years of falsified valuations. It named investors whose returns had been fabricated on paper while their actual capital was quietly rerouted through a chain of shell funds that Julian Voss controlled personally, outside of Vivian's knowledge, using Ashcroft Capital's name and reputation as the shield. It named the fire. It said in Otto's own words that Voss had discovered Otto was preparing to go to federal regulators, and that the fire had not been an accident, and that Otto had disappeared rather than wait to find out what came next. It said the flash drive contained 11 years of the real numbers, backed up from a system Voss didn't know Otto had ever had access to. Denzel was still kneeling on the concrete floor with the letter in his hands when the side door opened and Julian Voss walked in. There was no pretense of casual interest this time. Voss's eyes went straight to the letter, then to the open panel, then to Denzel's face, and whatever composure the man had built over 11 years of boardrooms simply left him. "Put that down," he said, his voice dropping into a register Denzel hadn't heard from him before, low and hard and finished with pretending. Denzel stood up slowly, the letter still in his hand. "You knew this car would come back into service eventually," Denzel said. "That's why you tried to buy it off her yourself before I ever got here, isn't it?" Voss took a step closer, close enough that Denzel could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing exactly how far he was willing to go in a garage with no witnesses. You don't understand what you're holding, Voss said. I understand exactly what I'm holding, Denzel said, and I understand that a man died so you could keep holding on to something that was never yours. Voss's jaw tightened. Otto isn't dead, he said, before he could stop himself, and then went completely still, realizing what he'd just confirmed. The door opened again. Vivian stood in the frame, having come to find them both for lunch, and the look on her face told Denzel she had heard enough of the last sentence to understand everything that mattered. "Julian," she said very quietly, "what did you just say?" What followed was not loud. That was the thing Denzel would remember most clearly afterward, how quiet it stayed even as it became the most dangerous conversation he'd ever stood inside of. Voss tried 3 different versions of the truth in under 2 minutes, each one collapsing faster than the last as Vivian asked questions with the flat, surgical precision of a woman assembling a case in real time, rather than reacting to one. 11 years, she said finally, her voice completely level. 11 years, and every valuation I signed off on, every investor I stood in front of and vouched for personally, was resting on numbers you fed me. I protected the firm, Voss said. You protected yourself, Vivian said, and when a man was about to tell the truth, you let him disappear into a fire, so the truth would disappear with him. She looked at Denzel. Call whoever you called, she said, now. Patricia Vance and 2 federal agents arrived at the estate 90 minutes later. Denzel stood off to the side of the garage with his hands in his pockets while Voss was walked out through the front gate in handcuffs, past the motor court, past the pool, where a very different kind of party had happened 3 weeks earlier, and it did not look anything like the satisfaction Denzel had expected to feel. It looked like watching a very expensive machine finally fail under the weight of everything it had been hiding for over a decade. Voss didn't look at Vivian as they put him in the car. He looked at Denzel, and for just a moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face, something that wasn't quite regret yet, but was close enough to see regret's shadow standing behind it. The federal case moved fast once it moved. Vance's office had been building a parallel inquiry into Ashcroft's overseas fund for months, unable to find the door in, and Otto's flash drive turned out to be the key that opened all of it at once. Word got out within days. Financial news picked it up first, then national coverage followed, the specific frenzy that erupts when a name that has spent a decade sitting beside words like visionary suddenly sits beside words like fraud and federal indictment. Vivian did not hide. She stood in front of cameras with the posture of a woman who had decided exactly how much ground she would and would not give, and she told the truth, publicly, completely, about what had happened inside her own company without her knowledge, and what she intended to do to make it right. Some investors left. She said she understood why and meant it. The ones who stayed did so because for the first time in years, they believed every word coming out of her mouth. 6 weeks later, Julian Voss stood in a federal courtroom and pled guilty to 11 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of arson resulting in a false report of death, the fire that had been staged not to kill Otto Kessler but to force his permanent disappearance, a plan that had gone further than even Voss claimed he'd intended. The judge's sentence ran to 19 years. Voss stood at the defendant's table when it was read, and for the first time since Denzel had watched him walk into that garage in his tailored coat, the man looked genuinely, completely undone. He asked, before they let him out, if he could say something to the room. The judge allowed it. I told myself for years that I was protecting people, Voss said, his voice cracking in a way that 11 years of boardrooms had never allowed it to. That the ends were worth it, that nobody would get hurt if the numbers eventually worked out. He looked briefly at Vivian seated 2 rows back. I convinced myself I hadn't taken anything from anyone because on paper it always balanced. He shook his head slowly. A man lost his name, his life, 4 years of hiding in a country where nobody knew who he used to be because I couldn't accept being ordinary. I don't expect anyone in this room to forgive that. I don't think I've earned the right to ask. It was the closest thing to an apology anyone in that courtroom had ever heard him give, and it did not undo one single thing he had done, and everyone there understood both of those facts at exactly the same time. Denzel watched from the gallery and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't triumph. It was closer to the feeling of finishing a job correctly. Complete. Quiet. Nothing left undone. Otto Kessler came back 4 weeks after the arrest. He called Denzel first from a number Denzel didn't recognize, his voice older than Denzel remembered, careful in the way of a man who had spent 4 years choosing every word like it might cost him something. "I am told," Otto said slowly, "that you found my letter." "I found it," Denzel said. "I am told you did not hesitate." "I hesitated plenty," Denzel said. "I just didn't stop." There was a long pause on the line, the kind that carries the weight of 4 years of silence inside it. "I am in a small town in Portugal," Otto said. "I make furniture now. It is quieter than engines, but it is honest work." "Yeah," Denzel said. "I know what that's like." Otto testified 8 weeks later, calm and precise on the stand the same way he had once been calm and precise over an engine block, and his testimony closed the last gaps in the federal case completely. Afterward, he stood outside the courthouse in a coat too thin for a Rhode Island winter and looked at Denzel for a long moment before he spoke. "You are your own man now, Daniel," he said, catching himself, then correcting it with a small, tired laugh. "Denzel. You have been for a long time. I hope you know that." The first real snow of the season came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the sentencing. It was the soft kind, the kind that doesn't shut down highways or cancel school, just quietly covers everything familiar in a layer of white that makes it look briefly new. Denzel was in the garage, finishing the last work on the Porsche, when the side door opened and Vivian came in, Josie beside her in a winter coat with the hood up, looking around the space with the serious, cataloging interest of a 7-year-old encountering a new environment for the first time. "I picked her up from school," Vivian said. "Her usual ride had a conflict. I should have called first." "It's fine," Denzel said, checking his daughter's face on instinct, the automatic parental inventory. She was happy, warm, completely unbothered, which told him Vivian had handled the pickup with more ease than most adults would have managed. Josie walked straight to the Porsche, put both hands on the hood, and looked up at her father. "Is this it?" she asked. "That's it," he said. She considered the car with enormous seriousness. "It's pretty," she said, "like really pretty. Did you fix it all the way?" "About 20 more minutes," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went to sit on the stool in the corner, the same stool Vivian always used, and pulled a book out of her backpack, because she was her father's daughter, and understood without being told that when someone is finishing important work, you don't interrupt, you just keep them company. Vivian watched Josie settle onto the stool, then looked at Denzel, and something moved across her face too complicated and too private to name, and he let it stay that way. She came and stood beside him at the engine, not watching the car, watching him work. After a while, she said quietly, "I've been thinking about the joke." He set down the wrench. "Which part of it?" he asked. "The promise part," she said. He straightened up and looked at her, the same direct, unguarded way she'd looked at him weeks earlier in the study, when she'd asked him why he'd done what he'd done, and he'd told her the truth, and she'd recognized it because she was someone who could always tell the difference. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not making a declaration either. I'm just telling you that, when I said that in front of those people I was performing something for an audience I'm not sure I even respected. And I'm standing in a garage in the snow with a man who is nothing like anyone I've ever known, and right now I don't feel like performing anything at all." She paused. "That's all I'm saying." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've got about 20 more minutes on this engine," he said. "I know," she said, "and then someone needs to take it for a drive. It should be you," he said. "You waited 7 years for this car to be whole. It should be all three of us," she said, and looked over at Josie on the stool, and the silence that followed didn't need filling. He finished the engine in 18 minutes, checking every system with the same unhurried patience he brought to the first step as the last: fuel delivery, ignition, cooling, oil pressure. Then he turned the key. The engine caught on the second try and found its voice immediately. That flat sound people who know Porsches describe as unlike anything else in the world. A mechanical conversation between parts finally given the chance to do exactly what they'd always been built to do. He let it warm for 5 minutes. Josie came off the stool and stood beside Vivian, who rested a hand loosely on her shoulder, the easy unconscious gesture of someone simply keeping a child close because it felt natural, not because anyone had asked her to. Denzel got out, opened the passenger door. Vivian got in without hesitating. He opened the rear door. Josie climbed in, tucked her book into her backpack, and said, "I've never been in a car this old." "You've never been in a car this honest," Denzel said. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means what you see is what you get," he said. "No computer telling you everything's fine when it isn't, just the machine doing exactly what it was built to do." "Like you," she said, with the plain, unfiltered accuracy of a 7-year-old who hadn't yet learned to soften the truth, and Denzel laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. He drove them out through the estate gate onto the shoreline road, where the snow fell softly over the water and the world went briefly, cleanly white. The Porsche moved the way it was always supposed to move, responsive, precise entirely itself, the product of engineering that had been buried and hidden, and finally recovered by someone patient enough to look for it. Vivian had her window cracked an inch, the cold air moving through the cabin. Josie watched the snow out the back window with the total absorption of a child who has decided this exact moment deserves her full attention. Nobody said us anything for a long stretch of road, and nobody needed to. Denzel Washington had $14 in his checking account the mornings this all began. He had a leaking hydraulic lift, a second-hand coffee maker, and a grief he'd been carrying so long it had become part of the architecture of his daily life. What he had that no fraud, no shell company, no falsified valuation could ever touch was the thing Otto Kessler had seen in him 15 years earlier in a barn in Ohio, the ability to look at something broken and understand, underneath all the analysis and credential and reputation, what it actually needed to become whole again. He had done it with the car. He had done it with the truth. And on a snowy road above the Rhode Island shoreline, with a woman who was only now learning what it felt like to be seen instead of assessed, and a daughter in the back seat who drew horses that could read and asked the most honest questions he'd ever heard in his life, he was quietly, without announcement, beginning to do it with himself. If Denzel's story stayed with you tonight, I'd love to know. Have you ever watched someone underestimate a person because of how they looked or what they did for a living, only to find out later exactly how wrong they were? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'm always struck by how much quiet strength walks around in ordinary clothes. And if you want more stories like this one, about people the world overlooked until it couldn't look away anymore, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.